Hello and welcome. We're now entering at the Brussels Forum, the climate forum area, the climate emergency issue for the next hour or so with two panels. I'm Nick Gowing. I'm a founder and director of Thinking the Unthinkable, but I'm here really to introduce Sir David King. But before I do that, let me just give you three things which I think need to be remembered, given the kind of language we've seen from the G7 on Sunday, from NATO on Monday, and also from the International Energy Agency. The G7 talked about the climate and environment and the climate emergency as an unprecedented, interdependent crisis of climate change and biodiversity loss, posing, quote, an existential threat to people, to prosperity, to security and nature. NATO, of all things, has realized that climate emergency is now a major security issue. Paragraph 58 of their communique on Monday, climate change is one of the defining challenges of our time. And Jens Stoltenberg, the Secretary General, has said very clearly, this is a crisis multiplier. Climate change is making the world a more dangerous place. And finally, from the International Energy Agency, in their report of about a month ago, when Fatih Birol said very clearly that this is the greatest challenge humankind has ever faced. Well, David, welcome. We have 15 minutes. We need to hear about both your frustrations. Do you have any optimism? The enormity of the task, not for 2050, but maybe for 2027, 2028, the enormous changes which have to happen in order to meet these pretty terrifying demands. What's your view about whether we're on track or not?
Well, we're not even close to being on track, Nick, and I think everyone would recognize that. Today, emissions are marginally lower because of COVID-19, but marginally. We're still emitting over 50 billion tons of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, and that emission level is increasing year on year. We are not even leveling off, let alone decreasing emissions year on year to hit that target of net zero by mid-century. Now, let me say, the second thing is that the risk that we've just heard, G7, NATO, IEA, all agreeing on the nature of the risks facing us. I do like what Fatih Birol says, the greatest challenge our civilization has ever had to face up to. So let me just explain why, quickly, I believe that. If I just take a look at the state of ice on the planet, so I'm going to the Arctic Sea, the Arctic Circle region, I'm going to the Antarctic, to the Himalayas, to any ice on land that has been there for thousands of years. And we're seeing the loss of that ice more quickly than was predicted 10, 15 years ago by the climate community. Today, the sea level rise, which was before simply the warming of the oceans due to global warming and water expanding as it warms, has increased by 24% due to the ice that is already entering the oceans. And there's a big risk because there's enough ice there to drive our sea levels up. Even losing the ice on Greenland alone will drive sea levels up by 7.5 meters. 23, 24 feet, globally average. Now, what this means is that let's take a shorter term view into the future, 2050. We're capable now of predicting that the country of Vietnam will be flooded by seawater once a year by that time on average. We all know about Bangladesh, Indonesia, the archipelago of Indonesia, also very close to sea level. The city of the capital city of Indonesia, Jakarta, has been flooded in January, February this year. And the government of Indonesia has decided to move its capital to higher ground very wisely. Think of the investment, which is for 15 million population, plus in the conurbation around it, another 15 million. That is a modern, bustling city. This is one of the tiger economies of the world. And we are seeing the loss of that city to seawater as we move forward just 30 years from where we are now. So the global calamity is quite simply enormous in scale.
You have been pressing this point for many years, but the penny to use the English phrase, seems to be dropping, at least certainly in the financial sector at the moment. But let me just come back to that phrase from the G7 meeting in Cornwall at the weekend: existential threat to people, prosperity, security, and nature in a matter of a few years. Do you think global leaders recognize that?
No, I don't, because I think that if global leaders could recognize that, they would understand that an existential threat of this kind requires major transitional actions, and it requires a massive effort in analyzing how to make the transitions without the creation of a really lower class of people who will simply lose jobs and suffer terribly going forward in time.
But we don't have time for this, do we? It's
Oh,
very urgent.
it is very urgent. I believe we've got time if governments understood the urgency of the problem. I think we do have time, but I'm going to say what we do over the next 5 years will determine the future of humanity for the next millennium. And we in that sentence means all of us, all of us.
You were a scientific advisor, you know how government works. You know the difficulties, the frailties, the disappointments of government. But do you think leaders and governments are really prepared to confront and go public with the enormity of the kind of thing that you've just been saying, and certainly has been confirmed by the G7 at the weekend?
Now, what is really disturbing is that we can get these very important statements from G7, NATO, IEA. You're quite right to highlight them. They're very recent statements. But are we getting similar statements from government leaders around the world? I think instead we find focusing on completely irrelevant issues. I'm just going to take as an example the recent meeting here in Britain, which the overall outcome was not a hefty focus on managing this enormous existential threat. I didn't see a plan being laid out by the G7 nations. And if the G7 nations don't give us a leadership on this, then where do we go? Now, I'm not really saying that we are doomed. I'm saying we can do it, and we have to do it, and we must do it all quickly. And I'm prepared to set out what I believe we must do.
But do you think, are you more or less saying that many political leaders and the government, the civil servants who are serving them, are really in denial about the scale? They almost cannot confront the enormity of what has to be done, not by 2050, but by 2030 or 2027.
I think the daily distractions of governments around the world is such that people are not fully focused. I don't want to suggest, for example, that Biden isn't focused. I think that Biden's appointment has been a very, very positive sign to the rest of the world. And I think his appointment may well lead to the transitions we've been hoping for over the period since '92, when we were all meeting in Rio. But finally, we're in a position where the United States can take a leadership position. So my optimism comes from an analysis which indicates that we might well get leadership at last from the United States on this issue, real leadership, by working with China, the two major economies of the world and the two major emitters working together at last. That would make a big transition. Bring in India, bring in the European Union, bring in those willing nations who can act, and we could begin to get a snowball action around the world that will lead to an understanding of what needs to be done. In other words, I think I set up something called Mission Innovation, and tremendous success. The idea was to spend $30 billion a year of public money on research and development into all the new technologies needed in the post-fossil fuel world by 2020. And we are close to spending that this year, and we've reached an agreement amongst those willing nations, 22 originally, now 25, to spend $40 to $45 billion a year by 2025 to deliver all of the technologies we need in this new world. So I feel we can move quickly. if those nations, those 25 nations representing 80% of the global GDP, also move with combined political actions, then I think we can begin to see the results emerging.
Well,
What
let's
we
look at can we look at the grassroots? People you know, people I know, our community, our families have to be persuaded that they've got to change the way they live. Not just about electric vehicles, but so much of the way we take for granted what we take for granted now. How can that be done? And I'm quoting here from the G7. Tangible actions needed in all sectors of our economies and societies. And the temptation is to think, well, it'll happen incrementally, but the need is absolutely profound and it's urgent.
The need is profound and urgent. Very, very important words you're using there, Nick. And what I would say is actually, we, human beings living in our daily lives, do make transitions. And we have made very significant transitions through the COVID-19 outbreak, and it hasn't all been negative.
But it needed the threat of survival almost, didn't it?
Yes, and I guess what I'm saying is we do have a threat of survival, but the trouble is we're on a longer burn. And people will always say, let's leave it till tomorrow. So there is that problem. But I'm going to suggest that the cultural transition in various countries towards managing not to keep throwing everything away and causing major problems, in other words, to create more of a circular economy, I think that is moving surprisingly well, given that it needs people to willingly follow suit and put things in the green bin or the appropriate colored bin, where instead of just throwing everything into one rubbish heap. So
What about the even more sinister part of this, Dave? The fact that it's all very well talking about net zero, but net zero is only about what we emit. It doesn't take any account of the carbon, which is already at very frontier border levels, which means we're unlikely to actually keep to the 1.5 degrees. In other words, this massive overhang of carbon that has already been created.
Quite right. So let me just very quickly put some figures to that. We are at 415 parts per million of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere today. The pre-industrial level was 270, 275. But if we add in methane, and methane emissions are now rising very rapidly, that figure is over 500 parts per million. I don't think there's a climate scientist who believes that we have a carbon budget left with 500 parts per million in the atmosphere already. In other words, what is happening to global ice on land is a result of us already exceeding the amount of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere that we should have. So a big part, and this is not very much on the agenda, of what needs to be done is not only to have deep and rapid emissions reduction, but also greenhouse gas removal at scale to bring the level of greenhouse gases down to something like 350 parts per million. That's an enormous challenge. I believe it can be done, but we need to focus a lot more effort, a lot more finance into this risk management process.
Final question in the last minute, if I may, Dave. In the end, you are a scientist, even though you've now branched out into government and many other things like running at Cambridge College. Is there any doubt about the science on this? Are we being over pessimistic, over gloomy?
Well, if anything, Nick, we have always tended to be over optimistic, and we've tended to play down the risks that were emerging. Today, what I'm saying is, yes, we're still tending to play down the risks because the next 5 years are the determinant of our civilization's future. Now, that really is a critically important message. Do I have any doubt about it? No. Does the scientific community still question any aspect of this? Not at all. So I don't think there's anything in the denial position at all. And nor do I think it has a following today.
Final comment, John Kerry and Fatih Birol have both said the same thing. Even if we uphold and do everything we promised to do with all our commitments, it's only half of what we need. That shows the scale, doesn't it?
I fully agree with the statement that John Kerry made there. I fully agree with it. And I know that not everyone does. A lot of people are saying all the technologies we need are there. And that Mission Innovation is planning to spend $40 billion a year by 2025. That's still not enough. And what we actually need is hundreds of billions of dollars being spent on managing the risks that are already being faced around the world.
So David King, thank you very much indeed. A short, but we've got a lot into 15 minutes, setting up very much the next session, Dave, particularly with the four industrialists who are going to join me in about 3 minutes. So please, everyone stay there, and do please, if you have any questions, put them on the chat line so I can put them to our guests. But thank you very much indeed. Gloom is not the word I'd use. I think it's being pragmatic given the scale of what we all face. But David King, thank you very much indeed for joining us from Cambridge. Stand by, everybody. I'll be back in about 3 minutes.
Thank you, Nick.